Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today we're going to go to the channel page, and you can see we've got the 4-part videos on the life of Admiral Nelson. But having 4 large video screens may not be to your preference. So fortunately, the section has a grid system, which you can see here, and the video will auto-snap to whatever size of box you put in. This is very handy because if you want to show lots and lots of videos, and let's face it, the channel does have quite a lot of videos, you don't want to have an infinitely large page with these very large windows if you can avoid it. And as you can see in this case, what I'm doing instead is making them smaller and snapping each video to the overall grid. So with this last one, episode 4, I want to make that nice and big so that potentially you could watch on the page itself rather than going straight to YouTube, and it's kind of obviously a highlight as well. So I'm keeping that larger, I'm center lining it, and that allows me to align my other 3 videos just above there. And as you can see, with a little bit of work on the drag boxes, it's very easy to make them all the same size. Then just go save and exit. And now this takes up a lot less space, and I think the presentation style looks a bit better as well. Dead easy with Squarespace. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. One of the questions that comes up semi-regularly on the channel is, why did battleships carry torpedoes? And looking at it from a point of view of where we sit now in the early 21st century, it might seem like a really dumb thing to do, considering that during the Second World War, battleships could fire at extreme ranges, far beyond what pretty much any torpedo could reach. And the torpedo was, of course, yet another weakness in the battleship, much like a ship's magazine, except that a torpedo launcher and its associated torpedoes tended to be even closer to the exterior of the hull. And of course, there were smaller and faster platforms running around with torpedoes, most nations' cruisers and all nations' destroyers, for instance. However, by World War II, it seems that most navies agreed with that assessment, as pretty much no modern fast battleship was constructed with torpedo launchers. Even Tirpitz, which famously did have them, had those added later on to assist in merchant raiding. Almost all capital ships in World War II that did carry torpedoes tended to be of the 1910s or 1920s vintage. So to examine this a bit more closely, we have to wind the clock back quite a bit further, back to the late 1860s and early 1870s, with the advent of the first self-propelled torpedoes, or locomotive torpedoes as they were called at the time. The first thing to remember is that battle line formations in this period were, aside from the fact they were using ironclads, near enough unchanged from the time period of Nelson, i.e. the battle fleet consisted of a bunch of heavily armed capital ships which would form a battle line and then proceed to try and blow the other battle line out of the water. There were, of course, variations on this tactic, since ramming was now in vogue, and of course the Nelsonian pell-mell close-range melee was also much in favour in some navies. But essentially the only time you could expect to see anything smaller than a true full-scale capital ship in such a battle would either be frigates and corvettes acting as scouts and signal relay vessels on the periphery of battle, but not taking part in the battle itself, or a variety of small-scale ironclads that had been constructed in the 1860s for the most part, very occasionally in the early 1870s, mostly as economy measures by nations that wanted to have ironclads but couldn't necessarily afford an 8, 10 or 12,000 ton full-scale capital ship. These ships would still be fairly heavily armoured and would usually just carry slightly fewer guns, but they were still seen as line-of-battle units. They were not some kind of heavily armoured subsidiary vessel like a frigate, dragged into the line against its will. And the reasoning for this was pretty simple. At the time, pretty much the only way to sink an enemy ship, outside of ramming, was to hit it with a lot of shells from your guns. And the best way to do that was to carry a lot of guns or to carry very heavy, very large guns, either of which necessitated a fairly large ship to support either a long gun deck, a large central battery, or just a handful of really, really, really big guns. And the general rule of thumb being that you should at least try to make your ship armoured against its own weaponry meant that these ships were also very heavily protected. There wasn't really any point in having anything substantially smaller or armed with anything particularly smaller in terms of firepower, simply because it wouldn't do a lot. A very small ship, or a ship that tried to emphasize speed over protection, would simply have its hull smashed open by the big guns of the various ships. And a ship that tried to mount smaller, theoretically faster firing weapons would at best find that it could fire very fast and very ineffectually against the massive armoured sides of most capital ships of the period, and therefore was completely useless. Or at worst, considering this was well before the so-called quick-firing gun came into vogue, you could end up with an inferior armament that didn't have much, if anything, in the way of a rate of fire advantage. And so there was no equivalent to what would later be thought of as a cruiser, or a torpedo boat, or a destroyer, or anything like that in the main battle fleet. Coupled to this was the fact that range finding hadn't really improved since, again, the Nelsonian period. Guns could theoretically fling a shell several miles, much the same way as a 32-pounder cannon on HMS Victory could, in theory, send its cannonball up to 3 miles downrange. But on a moving, pitching and rolling ship, the chances of you actually hitting anything at that kind of range, aiming with just the standard human eyeball, was pretty much zero. And so, whilst the armour, shipbuilding techniques, firepower and propulsion of capital ships had improved massively since Nelsonian times, battle ranges really hadn't. In ship-to-ship combat, it was expected that you would engage at maybe 500 yards. If you were ambitious, you might get into the high hundreds of yards, and someone who was a complete lunatic might try and actually open fire at 1,000 yards or slightly beyond if they were in really calm waters with an excellent gunnery crew and plenty of ammunition that they didn't mind wasting. But the technological improvements had led to something of a problem. Even if your guns were powerful enough to overcome the armour of the enemy ship, the simple fact was that with iron hulls had also come practical bulkheads, dividing the ship up into a series of theoretically independently watertight compartments. And although you could depress your guns to shoot down into an enemy vessel, basic deck armour could help prevent this in all but the most extreme cases. And that in turn meant that while you might be able to completely shoot up and devastate the upper portion of an enemy ship, its fundamental watertight integrity was almost impossible to breach, and even if you managed it in one section, the flooding probably wouldn't spread very far elsewhere. And that meant you had to resort to the same kinds of tactics as you would have found in the Age of Sail to truly ensure that your opponent was going to give up the fight. That is either boarding them or riddling them so much that you've killed off most of the crew with long-range gunfire. In either case, the gunfire that was coming in was pretty much horizontal, so again, wasn't likely to breach the watertight integrity of the ship, except in extreme circumstances. The fundamental problem with this was that ships had gotten considerably larger, and therefore riddling it well enough, especially through the extensive armoured citadels, to kill enough crew to persuade them to give up was relatively unlikely. It did occur in some cases, like with the capture of the ironclad Huascar, but it was a relatively small vessel. Or, as we mentioned, you could try and board the ship. Unfortunately, back in the day, the ship's method of propulsion was its sails, which meant you could control the means of propulsion by boarding along the upper decks. Now, with the means of propulsion being the steam engine, which was deep below, down several decks, and underneath usually an armour deck, you could control the upper decks all you liked, and somebody in an auxiliary steering position deep down in the ship could still take the ship wherever they wanted to go, and there wasn't a huge amount that you could do about it. And these factors, along with the Battle of Lissa, were what had led to the return of the ram. because if you either couldn't breach the enemy armour, or if you did, you weren't really going to affect their ability to continue to operate all that much, well, then you could get really close, and if you could get really close, then ramming somebody seemed like a good idea because that let water in the bottom, which is the traditional way of making a ship go under. Into all this was thrust the first Whitehead torpedo. The Whitehead torpedo seemed to offer essentially an extension to the idea of ramming, because after all it was a small self-propelled device which went from one ship to another, essentially conducted a ramming attack, but conducted a ramming attack that also happened to bring several hundred pounds of explosive with it, blowing a big hole in the bottom of the enemy ship and sending it to the bottom. This not only let water in, which as we said is the best way of sinking a ship, it also bypassed the majority of the ship's defences, which were configured to repel shell fire coming in above the water's surface, and it meant you yourself didn't have to get too close. Now, of course, there were disadvantages to this. The torpedo had to be aimed properly, and then you had to hope it ran properly, and you also had to hope the enemy just didn't get out of the way. But you could solve some of these issues by closing the distance partially and then firing your torpedoes. Or if you'd shot the enemy up enough, then perhaps as they slowed down to let lifeboats off, or you'd pierced their funnels or trunking so their speed had dropped off anyway, then they'd make an easier target because they would be moving slower and less likely to be able to maneuver, and so you could finish them off with a torpedo instead of a prolonged gun barrage. The simple threat of torpedoes being launched at you could also force the enemy to break their formation, which of course would be to your advantage if you could hold your formation and coordinate your gunfire better than they could. And by the late 1870s, a torpedo's range had increased from the admittedly pretty much only coup de grace range of 200 yards to around about 800 yards, which, as we've established, is actually about the same range you'd be engaging in a gunfight if you expected to hit anything. So the torpedo and the shell could be expected to reach out and hit the enemy at approximately the same range, only the torpedo would be statistically slightly less likely to hit due to the long travel time and the need therefore to anticipate where the enemy was going to be. But if it did get there, one hit could be catastrophic for the opponent. Now, of course, one big problem with this was that in order to get your torpedoes in range of the enemy, you were also straying into range of their torpedoes, and battleships are big, expensive units. And hence the development of the torpedo boat to try and deliver the ship-killing weapon without the risk of the big, heavy battleship getting into range of its counterpart. And then, of course, the torpedo gunboat, and then the torpedo boat destroyer to counter the torpedo boat, and then later to initiate their own torpedo attacks, which also in some ways drove the development of cruisers, which split into two distinct lines: armoured cruisers, which in the late part of the 19th century were viewed as a potential auxiliary in the battle line itself and tended to have more armour and bigger guns, but would also usually carry torpedoes, and smaller protected cruisers. There were unprotected cruisers for colonial missions, but mostly in the battle line or in the fleet, you'd be looking at protected cruisers, which were there in part to counter the torpedo boats and torpedo boat destroyers, but of course would also carry their own torpedoes, much as the torpedo boat destroyers did, so that they could use them in torpedo attacks once they destroyed the other smaller torpedo-carrying craft. But in the event of mutual annihilation of these smaller craft, or indeed the approach of some of the larger ones in the form of cruisers, a battleship carrying its own torpedoes not only now had the theoretical capability of taking out one of its opponents in direct combat very quickly, they could also unleash them at incoming cruisers, for example, which might otherwise pose a threat with their own torpedoes, so it still made logical sense. But as we get to the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, you start to see the more widespread deployment of rangefinders aboard capital ships. And this is borne out by two conflicts: the Spanish-American War, immediately preceding the turn of the century, where for the most part rangefinders were either not present or present only in very primitive forms, and where accurate gunnery could only be seen up to about 800 to 1,000 yards, maybe a fraction more if you're being generous, which was still well within the range of torpedoes of the time, and the Russo-Japanese War in the middle of the 1900s, where gunnery, thanks to the implementation of rangefinders in the first half of that decade, had suddenly increased in effectiveness to the point that ships were engaging at 4,000, 5,000 or 6,000 yards. And you might be thinking, aha, Drake, well, this is clearly where battleships should have stopped having torpedo launchers installed on them, because gun ranges now exceed a torpedo's effective range by a factor of 3, 4, maybe even 5, and therefore the torpedo is no longer of any use except as a weapon aboard fast attack craft which can close that distance. Except, of course, that torpedoes had continued their technological development as well. The C-03 model in Germany, the Bliss-Levitt 21-inch Mark I in the United States, or the 18-inch Mark VI in the UK, were all being deployed around about the time of the Russo-Japanese War, and they could all reach out to around about 4,000 yards. Give or take a little bit, at least as long as you set them to the slower running speed settings. But, as those of you who view the channel regularly will know, battle ranges kept increasing rapidly throughout the 1900s, as more and better rangefinders were installed and early fire control systems were adopted. So it might seem that, okay, maybe the Russo-Japanese War still had merit when it came to battleship-launched torpedoes, but surely by the middle of the Dreadnought race, it was pretty much a done deal. Well, again, not so much. By around about 1910, the British were deploying, for example, the 18-inch Mark VII torpedo and the 21-inch Mark I torpedo, which could reach out, again at the slower speed settings, to 7,000 or 12,000 yards, respectively. The Americans were looking at the Bliss-Levitt 21-inch in Mark VIII and Mark IX forms, which could reach out to around about 9,000 to 10,000 yards, and the Germans were looking at the 19.7-inch or 50-centimetre G7 torpedo and its immediate predecessor, the G6 and G6D, which could also, again at the slower speed settings, reach out to about 9,000 to 10,000 yards, and in 1910, 9,000 to 10,000 yards was still well in the ballpark for realistic expected battle ranges. And so the installation of torpedoes on battleships continued, because, quite frankly, the torpedo was capable of reaching out to what was expected to be battle range, and it offered, as before, a potential, rather nasty punch to throw at the enemy, with all the issues that we've explained earlier, just at slightly further distances. The First World War, however, showed a rather distinct problem in the practice of battleships launching torpedoes at their opponents as compared to the theory. Although the theory ran perfectly well, the torpedo was an incredibly powerful weapon even against the rudimentary anti-torpedo defences of the period in the more modern ships, and it could range out to a distance that was approximately similar to that of a shell at normal battle ranges. There were some rather major problems showing up. Firstly, battleships didn't carry that many torpedoes, and they took quite a while to reload, which meant that even at something like, say, the Battle of Jutland, firing torpedoes was a long and laborious affair compared even to the process of reloading and firing 12, 13.5-inch or 15-inch guns. Another problem was that the proliferation of escorts meant that there was now quite often a cruiser, a destroyer, or more in between you and the ships that you were engaging, so you'd have to watch out for friendly fire. And the fire control solution for a torpedo had gotten immensely more complicated. For example, if you'd been trying to calculate the offset in a Russo-Japanese War era battle, for example, using a British 18-inch Mark VI torpedo, which could reach out to 4,000 yards at 28.5 knots, if your opponent was, let's say, 3,000 yards away, that gave you a run time of about 3 minutes or just over. If your target was only doing 16 to 18 knots and was in a battle line, then predicting where it was going to be in about 3 minutes wasn't actually all that difficult. And the reason I'm using 3,000 yards instead of 4,000 is, of course, because you're having to predict where the target's going to be, then assuming that it's approximately speaking parallel to you, you have to aim ahead, and therefore you're firing the torpedo down the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle in the simplest fire control solution. Of course, if you're really lucky, you could be engaging a ship that was roughly perpendicular to you with your guns, but shooting your torpedoes at a ship that was maybe 1 or 2 back in the column, and therefore you could take advantage of a perpendicular shot, but that adds an additional layer of complexity. However, if you were at, say, the Battle of Jutland and you were armed with a 21-inch Mark II triple star torpedo, if you calculated a range to hit your opponent of, say, 10,000 yards, so in this case that probably meant that your enemy was going to pass by you, so they were behind you, so you could make that perpendicular shot, then, well, that torpedo had a lot further to go, and its slow speed setting to reach that distance was only 31 knots, as compared to the 45 knots which it could achieve at shorter distances. This meant you were now looking at a travel time of between 9 and 10 minutes, and predicting where your opponent was going to be 9 or 10 minutes later was a much more difficult task, and your opponent will be travelling a little bit faster than a pre-dreadnought battleship, so that's going to make the job even more difficult. And with some other torpedoes which had even slower slow speed settings, obviously as the travel time of the torpedo increases, and perhaps you're firing at a slightly faster vessel like a Queen Elizabeth class or a battle cruiser, then not only is your torpedo's time in the water extended, but the distance the enemy ship is travelling is also considerably extended, and with it moving faster anyway, the chance of intersection goes way, way down, quite apart from the fact that at an extended range you have to be much, much closer on your bearing than you could be at closer ranges. For example, if you were shooting at a pre-dreadnought-sized target at 3,000 yards, in our previous example from the Russo-Japanese War, you could afford to have an accuracy spread of around about 2.8 degrees, and you would still hit the target. That is to say, if you were aiming at the amidships portion of a target, you could be about 1.4 degrees off in either direction, and you'd still hit it. Whereas at 10,000 yards, even if you were shooting at something the size of the considerably larger HMS Tiger, your angle of spread or angle of error has dropped to 1.35 degrees, which meant that, again, if you're assuming you were aiming for the amidships portion of Tiger, now you can only afford to be off by about 0.65 of a degree in either direction. And that, of course, was assuming you got all your calculations correct and it was just your firing angle that might be slightly off. Because, obviously, at that kind of distance, if you were looking at a pre-dreadnought and you thought, that's going at 16 knots, and you only have to worry about 2 to 3 minutes in the future, your margin of error on that count could be out by a little bit, and you'd still be okay. Whereas if you were looking at a 9 to 10 minute run to the aforementioned HMS Tiger, and you thought she was running at 28 knots, but in fact she was running at 26, or maybe she'd pushed her boilers and she was going at 29, over 9 to 10 minutes, that would considerably alter where the ship was when the torpedo arrived. So even if your calculation had been exactly spot on and your aim had been exactly spot on for the data that you'd put in, if the ship was even a knot or two out of that, it would miss completely. An appreciation of these facts, both in theory and then as they were borne out in combat, led to the beginning of the demise of torpedoes aboard capital ships. However, there was one last gasp for the battleship-mounted torpedo. Partly, there was still the idea that a disabled ship could be finished off much more quickly by torpedoes, and if the torpedoes happened to be on hand on a passing capital ship, so much the better. You didn't have to call up more vulnerable units, which might be taken out by the sinking vessel's main armament or even secondary battery. On top of that, you still had the disruptive qualities of the torpedo, just making an enemy break formation, even if there was precious little chance of you actually hitting them except by pure blind luck, could still have some tactical value. And lastly, torpedoes themselves continued to increase in their capabilities. By the end of the 1910s and the early 1920s, for example, American Mark 11 and Mark 12 torpedoes could reach out to around 15,000 yards, Several Japanese torpedoes could reach out to just over 16,000 yards, and one, the Type 8 No. 2, introduced in 1920, was even capable of a heady 21,900 yards at its slowest setting. And although the British 21-inch Mark V could only reach out to a relatively pedestrian 13,500 yards by the end of the 1910s, there were of course the 24.5-inch torpedoes installed on the Nelson-class battleships, which could hit 20,000 yards at 30 knots with a very considerable warhead. So although battle ranges, as experienced in the Second World War, had increased to 15 to 20,000 yards and were looking at potentially going up even further, it seemed like the torpedo might still be able to at least mostly match these increases in range. And hence, with torpedoes launched from battleships still potentially being somewhat useful, the last generation of capital ships constructed before the Washington Naval Treaty kicked in, the Colorados, Nagatos, and Nelsons, all carried torpedo launchers of varying sizes and numbers. However, over the interwar period, capital ship construction was for the most part restricted, and, as time went on, gun ranges continued to increase, or at least their effective engagement distances did, to the point that by the mid to late 1930s, people were thinking in terms of engagement ranges of 20 to 25,000 yards being relatively easily possible for most capital ships, and a bit beyond that in some of the more ambitious navies. The problem was that outside of the Japanese long lance, torpedo range had pretty much remained static at around 15,000 yards, or had actually begun to drop in favour of shorter travel distances but considerably higher speeds, as the aforementioned issues that had cropped up in our theoretical targeting of HMS Tiger applied across the board, and it was held that, well, if there was precious little chance of you hitting something at, say, 10,000 or 12,000 yards with a torpedo that was only capable of doing about 30 to 31 knots at that distance, it would be much, much simpler and easier to try and hit something at 6, 7, 8,000 yards with a torpedo that was doing 45 knots or something similar to that. This, combined with the treaty restrictions, which imposed a variety of limits on what you could put on a battleship, but most importantly for our purposes, restricted overall displacement to 35,000 tons. With the increase in need for anti-aircraft firepower and the systems associated with that, on top of what had originally been envisioned at Washington and then later the London treaties, battleship designers faced some very stark choices. They had to save weight every which way they possibly could, and by the time battleship construction restarted in the mid-1930s, when they looked at torpedoes, they were looking at a weapon that was now considerably outranged by the guns that they were expected to install on these ships, to the order of 10,000 yards or more. Even if a battleship wandered into that torpedo's range, it was fairly unlikely to actually hit due to the range considerations that we've talked about previously with the Tiger example. It also presented a potential weakness because of the launcher needing access to the sea and the torpedoes themselves being stocked full of highly flammable fuels as well as explosives. And even if the torpedo launchers weren't hit, they took up quite a lot of room and quite a lot of weight in exchange for a system that was of relatively minimal direct effectiveness. At most, it would probably be a disruption weapon as opposed to a direct impact weapon. And by that point, there were so many other ships out there, including the newfangled aerial torpedo bombers, as well as destroyers and submarines, that could carry and deliver torpedoes at much higher speeds, much closer to the enemy, that when the time came to decide what systems could be eliminated to save weight in favour of putting in more boilers, more armour, or more guns, it was a fairly easy decision to eliminate the torpedo launchers entirely. And on ships that were being refitted and modernised, the torpedo launchers were usually taken off for the same reasons. And ironically enough, even though the Japanese, as we mentioned, with the Long Lance, did have a torpedo that theoretically could actually reach out and touch people at a distance that was commensurate with their expected battle ranges, the Yamato class were expected to engage at such ridiculously further ranges still that proportionally the distance between the engagement range of a Yamato's main guns and the engagement range of a theoretical set of long lance launchers mounted in the ship's hull was actually proportionally about as much of a gap as there was between the much shorter ranged Allied torpedoes, or German torpedoes, or Italian torpedoes, and the expected engagement ranges of the guns of their battleships. And even on ships that were largely ignoring the treaty limits, like the Bismarcks and Littorios, it was again a simple matter of, well, we eliminate this, we eliminate a potential weak spot, we save tonnage we can put to other purposes, and we're losing a weapon that, once more, really was probably at this point, due to the extreme ranges involved, was probably unlikely to ever hit anything. And thus, the demise of the torpedo launcher aboard the battleship. Of course, it is somewhat ironical that lots and lots of battleships fired torpedoes at each other in World War I, when in theory they were still a potentially effective weapon and didn't hit anything, whereas in the Second World War, a point at which everyone had pretty much dismissed the torpedo mounted aboard the battleship as a viable weapon, was the only conflict where we actually saw a battleship torpedo another battleship when Rodney torpedoed Bismarck during the latter's final engagement. So there's a brief history of why battleships mounted torpedoes for so long. Essentially, it came down to there was a relatively decent chance that the torpedo would actually have some beneficial effect for the ship that was launching it, and right up around the time when both practical evidence in combat as well as theoretical calculations started to show that this wasn't really the case, it started to be eliminated in newer designs, although it would hold over in older designs simply because of the sheer size of the system being so heavily integrated into ships that it would be quite expensive to remove them unless you were doing a full modernization. So, hope you found that interesting, and see you again in another video.